Howdy tubes, welcome back to the Zach Life. So in this video we're going to go through the basic oversimplified chemical composition of paints, how they work, the different kinds, mixtures, etc. Now I've already done a video very similar to this that was for external. If you're painting metal, if you're painting the outside siding of your motorhome, you can go watch it. I'll put a video in the comments, link in the comments I mean. But this is specifically for inside of your motorhome. This is painting cabinets, this is painting wood, maybe some fiberglass, etc. So at the end of this video, I've already 2 days ago I painted some wood samples, pressure treated dry pine, and then a sanded and unsanded version of that pressed board with the fake looking wood stuff you see in a lot of motorhomes, both with oil based and water based, and we're going to compare one to the other and how well they stick, etc. If you want to just see the end result, you can skip to it. It's at the end of the video. But if you want to have a better understanding of the composition of the paint and the differences and why some things work better than others, let's do it. So in a grossly oversimplified world, there's sort of three parts to paint. There's a thinner, which is what dissolves the paint. It's what makes the paint a liquid in a paint can. There's a substance that dries and gets hard. Typically this is a resin or some kind of a synthetic plastic. And then there's pigments. Now we're going to disregard the pigments because we don't care what color your paint is. We just want whatever color paint that you want to both adhere, to wear well, to stick, to not turn loose, and to last the life of whatever you're painting. So to start off, there's different kinds of thinners. There's different kinds of liquids that dissolves the paint. Now there's four basic kinds, and I'm going to say right now that there are some mixtures of different kinds of paints, and there's no way in one video that you go over every possible kind of paint. But there are some real basic, and there's not near as many as you would think there'll be, kinds of paints. So with the solvents, there's four basic kinds of solvents. There's water, there's oil, which I hate to say oil-based paints because they're actually a petroleum distillant. I mean, they come from petroleum, but whatever. There's water, there's oil, there's alcohol, and there's nitrocellulose. Now, nitrocellulose is lacquer thinner. You've heard of lacquer thinner. We're going to start with lacquer thinner, and I'm going to back up into the second part of paint, and that is a substance that is soluble by a thinner, that after the thinner dries it will cure and or get hard. Now in most paints this is a type of resin. In lacquer thinner it's actually a synthetic plastic, as I understand it. It's a plastomer. We're going to start off talking about lacquer paint, and the cool thing and the thing that's a little bit unusual about lacquer paint, what makes it superior in some ways. Lacquer paint is unusual in that if you have dried lacquer paint and you put lacquer thinner on dried lacquer paint, it actually dissolves it and turns it back into paint. Like, you put a chunk of dried lacquer paint, mix it with lacquer thinner, and it turns back into lacquer paint. Now this could be a good and bad thing, because if you get lacquer thinner on it, it dissolves it. But what's the advantage to it is that if you paint a coating of lacquer paint and it dries, when you put another coat on it, the lacquer thinner in the paint you put over the dried lacquer paint dissolves the dried lacquer paint under it. So the two coats mix and chemically become a single coat. So if you take and put 5 coats of lacquer paint and you sand it down, you won't see the division lines of the different layers of the paint, which in enamel oil-based paint and latex often you can, and that can be a problem. The other great advantage to lacquer paint is that it is ultra hard. If you put it on something like a floor or a piece of trim, a handrail, something like that you grab all the time, it'll wear better than just about anything else, furniture, etc. The problem with it too, though, is because it is so hard and it doesn't have any kind of give, if you would, it will dull and scratch like the clear coat on your car. So if if it's got dirt on it and you rub your hand on it with dirt, you can actually abrade the surface and make it dull. The other issue with it is, if it's on wood, it's not real suitable for high moisture places. So if you get it wet all the times, sometimes it can release from wood. That can cause problems. Going back up the line, there's an alcohol-based paint. Now this is shellac. So there's a bug that lives in a tree somewhere in India that secretes a resin, and that's called shellac resin, and this is soluble by denatured alcohol. Now shellac paint is a unusual paint because it is soluble in alcohol, and this can be a big advantage in some situations, say like stains and stuff, or a furniture sealer that you want to soak in the wood, that you want to be, a really hard, long-lasting paint stain, etc. The alcohol will soak into wood fibers much better than either oil-based or water-based paint, and this is a great advantage. Now shellac paint is an absolute thing of the past. It sort of went to the wayside in the early 20th century because it's expensive, it's kind of hard to manufacture, and it's got some other kind of problems if you actually try to use it as paint. Now you can't typically find it as a paint nowadays. It's typically a stain or a sealer. We'll back up to an oil-based paint. Now an oil-based paint there's several different kinds of resins and stuff in it that can be used, enamels, but of all of them, they're all an oil-based, oil-soluble resin, and they all act similarly in that when an oil-based paint dries, or primer, it creates a polymer matrix, and that's unsoluble. And so that's why you can do things like take an oil-based paint and put on an engine or in an engine compartment that'll be greasy and oily, and the oil and the grease won't redissolve the paint. Once oil-based paint enamels are dry or cured, they can't be uncured unless you put something, of course, like a paint stripper on it. Now let's back up to water-based. Now water-based paint, there's two common kinds of what am I trying to say, resins. So the most common probably today is latex. Now latex paint is called latex paint because it used to be a rubber-based paint, and that's not so anymore. Today it's water-based, but it is some kind of a synthetic resin that they made. It's very similar to an acrylic resin. Now a lot of times when you see acrylic or latex or water-based paint, it's a combination of latex and acrylic resins thinned with water. Now if you see a paint that says acrylic, it's still a water-based paint, but sometimes just calling it acrylic, it's a little bit different than latex or water-based, even though water-based is acrylic, because it'll have some chemicals and stuff in it mixed in with the water that cause it to be a little bit more flexible, a little bit more water resilient. But latex, acrylic, water-based, sort of all in the same category. There's a few differences in them, but they're basically all the same thing. Now one side note, all water-based paint is either latex or acrylic, but not all acrylic is always water-based. They do make oil-based acrylics. That is something that exists, and you can treat it simply as an oil-based paint instead of a water-based paint. But if you see acrylic, you need to look and see exactly what kind it is. So one more point to be made is that these paints we're talking about, the stuff you paint your house with that you go to Lowe's and buy, this kind of paint has no ability to stick, if you would. It doesn't adhere to things. This is a stark difference between this kind of paint and say an automotive paint or like a can of Rust-Oleum, and I absolutely 1000% don't recommend painting metal or something with a Rust-Oleum paint. I kind of explain it in my other video, and that's because even if it does stick, a lot of that paint is actually air and water permeable, and you can have rust and stuff form behind the paint that will actually make the paint release. But the way that this paint that we're discussing today works, the way it sticks to your wall, so to speak, is not that it sticks, it's that it is absorbed into the fibers, into the wood, sheetrock, etc. Now when you stack multiple layers of paint, they have some chemical adhesion, and that's different than the chemical adhesion like to metal. But that's paint to primer or paint to paint. But the actual paint is not sticky, it doesn't stick to wood, and you absolutely cannot take oil-based, Kills primer and put it on your frame or put it on something that's metal outside. There'll be absolutely no adhesion. It'll change its color, but you go through a car wash and you'll be able to just blow that stuff right off there. You'll get rust to form under it. That's just not how any of this stuff works. So for each of these pieces of interior, I'm going to sand half of these, 220 grit with a DA. Here's what we're using for the water-based. This right here will be the oil-based. These both have a 1 hour dry time to repaint. I'm going to let them sit an hour. It's about 85 degrees, 85 degrees, high humidity, which isn't the best deal, but I'm going to give them an hour, recoat them, and then we'll catch you in 2 days and we'll see what they turned out like. So we're going to start out with the oil-based. So this is a piece of pine, this is a piece of pressure treated wood. I thought it might be a good idea to try this on pressure treated. So I'm just going to take my knife and we're going to see if we can separate this primer from the wood. Okay, this is what I wanted to see. I want you to notice this little piece right here. I'm cutting a super thin line off of the paint. And so there's absolutely zero separation of the paint from the wood. See, I'm actually cutting the paint and or cutting the wood. There is absolutely no separation between the wood and the paint. That's what we want. Now this is the regular pine, this is not pressure treated. I'm going to call this exactly the same. There's no separation between the wood and the paint. This is a cross section here. You can see how we peeled just a slight layer, thin little piece of wood, and the paint is actually soaked in. There's sort of a transitional area between the actual paint and the actual wood. Let's try the same thing with the water-based. I'm going to say the same thing with the water-based on the dry piece of pine. I don't like water-based paint, but you can see there is absolutely no separation where I plane a piece off here. There's no separation between the actual paint and the wood fibers. honestly a little bit surprised. So this is the dry pine. This is the dry pine. That last piece was the pressure treated. We're going to say the same thing. There's no way to remove the paint without removing a superficial layer of wood. You can see clearly right there. Okay, so here's the water-based. This is the typical crap that you know, the veneer you see on the cabinets in your motorhome. So this half is sanded, this half is not. I wrote sand on this side. So now I got to get you in frame here. This is hard to do and watch the screen of the camera and not cut my finger. So I am actually just barely able to separate this wood and paint. You can see this is hard to tell. See, like right there, I sort of broke the paint off. It's this flake right there. There's no wood attached to that. I sort of broke the paint off of the wood. Let's try this side here. Now, this is what I expected. This is your typical unsand latex paint. On a plastic veneer, or a wood veneer, I mean. This is classic paint failure. You know, there's a full flake of paint you can pull off. It is absolutely not stuck to that. Let's try the same thing. So this side is sanded, this side is not. And I'd like to make a point here. This is two coats. It seemed to be about the same thickness, the same heaviness as the water base, but this did not cover as well. This would have taken 3 coats. You can still see, I don't know how well you can see. You can still sort of see through it, see brush strokes. Okay, so this side is sanded. So let's try this right here. Now this is what I wanted to see, at least in this side. So you can see right here where I pulled this paint off and actually pulled off a layer of the wood, of the press board. And under that layer of press board, the paint has actually soaked through the wood, slightly, and it has paint under the surface of the wood. Now this is, you know, a good thing, because it makes the adhesion inseparable. You know, same deal. You pull, you know, this a superficial layer of wood off, and it's still got paint pigments under it. So let's try the unsanded side. Now this is not nearly as good. However, you absolutely would not be able to peel this off. I was trying to get it to separate the paint from the from this little veneer that's glued onto the press board, whatever you call the wood grain sticker. Now this is nowhere near as good as sanded. So let's make a side-by-side comparison here. I absolutely could pull this paint off of here. However, you can see in about 50% of it I was being very careful trying to separate the paint from this wood veneer. And I did do it. There's some spots. But for the most part, the paint was stuck to this veneer about as good as the veneer was to the wood, which in my opinion would be adequate. You know, this doesn't fall off of cabinets typically. However, the latex is just about as unstuck as could be. Now, it was regardless of what kind of paint you put over this, it'll still only be stuck this good. I think this is typical of people getting on and, you know, the forums and saying, hey, I painted my RV and all the paint's falling off. What do I do? There's your answer. So what's the conclusion? Well, the latex paint did extremely well in a lot of aspects, and this comes to a surprise to me. I expected it to suck in all aspects. The proof is in the pudding, as they say. You saw the pressure treated lumber and the dry pine. As far as adhesion, as permeation, it was the same. I can't tell any difference. It worked very well. The difference is that you see in the press board. Now, there was not a lot of difference in the adhesion to that sanded press board, but there was absolutely some. You know, you could peel that latex off, and the oil base, you know, you see as you cut on it, you actually remove a superficial layer of wood, and it still had paint below it. It soaked through it. And I think that this has probably got something to do with the composition of the wood itself. I think that there is probably some petroleum products and some waxes and stuff that are used as binders in that wood, and I don't know this for a fact. I'm just rattling this off my head. And I think perhaps that oil-based product helps to soak in those waxes and stuff to where the water-based is completely rejected by the waxes and the greases and petroleum products that's in that press board. Do you need to sand your cabinets? Well, absolutely. You know, you saw what went on. Now, is oil-based superior? I would say it's superior by at least 1,000%. You know, if you can dig your thumbnail in some of that, peel a little bit of it off, it's going to be scratched. You know, you got a wedding ring on, you grab your handle on your cabinet, you're going to scratch that. And then obviously the latex on here, you know, this is just about as useless as you can be. Please don't put latex over your cabinets without sanding them, because it's going to be a disaster and you're going to have a horrible time. And if you do, well, we all like horror stories, so you can put it on one of the Facebook deals or in the comments of this video or whatever. So I would also like to make an ending comment about paints versus primers versus paints and primers. And I'm not saying that you can't use a paint and primer in one, because I think in some situations you can. Say for instance, latex in a house with sheetrock. The problem with this arises is that they're chemically designed to do two different things. And so your primer is designed to seal, it's designed to adhere, it's designed to grab around wood fibers or whatever. It's not necessarily designed to carry pigments and to look perfect and to be exactly what you want. Now, if you want to paint something with White Kills primer and leave it that color, well, I don't see a problem with that. If you want something that's a weird, like a teal color or some kind of off the wall color, well, it's very difficult to take a primer and chemically have it suspend and equalize pigments so that things look well. And so they give in paint and primer in one, they give a lot of the primerness, if you would, away to make the paint look good. And in my opinion, a paint and primer, it just isn't a good idea. You're going to have to put 3 or 4 coats of everything anyway. Just start with a coat of primer and do it correctly. So I know this video was long-winded. I hope you liked it. I hope it gives you some insight and some good knowledge. As I like to say, knowledge is the key to success, and I absolutely believe that is true. I am as unartistic as someone can be. I can design, I can weld, I can build, I can fabricate anything. I'm a machinist, a welder, a fabricator, a mechanic. I can do anything like that. But you get me into something artistic like this, and it's way outside of my league. And I've got some buddies that are really good at it, and I've had some guidance. You know, you can go watch my RV I'm building. And you know, I've had some guys, it's like, you need this kind of paint, you need this kind of primer, you need this, you need to sand with this, you need to use this, you need to prep with that, you need this kind of paint gun. Give me a little bit of technique, and you really can do things that you don't think you have the ability to do if you have the correct knowledge. Now, that's not to say I can go paint a car as easily and have it look as perfect as someone that paints it every day, but I can absolutely stumble through a paint job and make something that looks really, really good. And that's not because I've got a God-given talent to paint or anything like that. It's just because I've got the correct kind of knowledge. I've got people I can call and say, hey, what I do, and I've got the guidance about the right kinds of paints and materials. And I hope that this video leads you in that way. I'm not a painter, but I do understand the chemistry of a lot of this stuff, and some trial and error, what works, what doesn't, will get us all heading in the right direction. So happy RVing, fellas. Hope y'all enjoyed the video. Give it a thumbs up, hit the bell, subscribe, yada yada yada. Y'all have a great one.